Alright guys, I don't know why everyone moved back so much. Everyone got scared. But it's still sending Alright guys, so did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I named this talk Christosenicity, really? So I think if we're going to sum up this whole discussion in a couple of verses, it's going to be from 1 Corinthians. So St. Paul writes, if there is no resurrection of the dead, Christ is not risen. If Christ is not risen, our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. For if the dead do not rise, Christ is not risen. If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile, as you are still in your sins. This is essentially the whole idea behind Christianity. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, then there's no Christianity. Every single thing we've been doing for the past 2,000 years is pointless. It makes sense, right? Because through Christ's death and resurrection, we're saved from our sins. We're going to just go through, it's an apologetic topic. What are the historical evidences that we have for the resurrection of Jesus? I'm going to skip the first few slides of why this stuff is important. Essentially, new atheism and naturalism nowadays, you're going to be attacked, right? And we're typically defending our faith. Like someone attacks us, we defend. We bounce right back at them, right? But you can take another approach, is playing offense. But that requires you knowing some history, right? Some archaeology, some, I don't know what you call it, studying people. But like the history of the people that existed, right? You have to know stuff, bottom line. You have to read. Know your audience. But I'm going to start with something that you might have heard. Pagan myths, such as the Egyptian god Osiris, or something that came in the Greek literature later, Mithras. And these pagan gods, basically, they have the same sort of, not the same exact, but essentially they're gods who have to do with the afterlife. And Mithras, even, it's a god who dies and comes back to life. And someone tells you, oh, the New Testament just copied these things. How do you respond? Well, how does someone know how they would respond? What's the first question that you might ask that person? What? You can say, who is Mithras? I never heard of Mithras. This is why you have to know the evidence for what you believe in before you can even start to attack something you haven't heard of. I don't know who Mithras is until last week, until I read about this person. So, the New Testament is loaded with eyewitnesses and historical figures. This is sort of a background for what we're going to be talking about today. So what does it mean to be an eyewitness and to be a historical figure? It means you're rooted in the history of the world, right? We're not going to really talk about the spiritual consequence of the resurrection. We're going to talk about it as being an event in history, about 2,000 years ago, something that happened, right, in the past. The empty tomb, right? So Christ wasn't in the tomb after the resurrection. That has to be something that's explained as well, historically. The early non-Christians who received the gospel and who received the New Testament, they knew the New Testament was not a legend. They knew it was historic. It was a historical document, right? So treated as such. No Greek and Roman legend describes the incarnation of a God, followed by the death and resurrection. Right? Which is exactly what Christianity does. The first real parallel comes in 150 AD. So that's much later. Does anyone else know what comes around 150 AD? What type of Gospels? Gnostic Gospels, right? It's a movement that happened much later. And just because these stories exist doesn't mean the New Testament copied them. This is just an example of something that you might be faced with. Okay, so you have to really just get in the habit of thinking, asking these questions. When did these things come arise? If they come much later than the resurrection, then they actually copied the New Testament documents, right? So, 5 E's of evidence. And I know how to count, I know the 5th one's not there. So, this is essentially the order we're going to go in. The execution of Jesus, did it happen or did it not happen? Believe it or not, some people and by people I mean our peers, are going to say Jesus didn't even exist. We're going to just assume that he did for the purposes of this thought. No historian, by the way, is going to debate the historical existence of Jesus. So if someone comes up to you and says, we don't know if Jesus existed, which happened to me, and I'm in a PhD program, and someone came up to me and said Jesus didn't exist, I look at him, I'm like, yo, what are you talking about? Have you read any textbook? Right? This is a historical fact. Jesus the man existed. And it's also, I'm going to show you, it's a historical fact that he was executed. He died. The empty tomb, eyewitness testimony, early records, these are all the E's that we're going to be talking about, and I added a fifth one, even to death, which is basically the apostles and disciples of Christ. They went to their graves proclaiming that he was risen from the dead. Okay? And each one of these has certain implications. So I'm going to give you some facts that are accepted by historians, and these are historians, some of them are Christian, most of them aren't, and some of them, historians also, some of them are conservative, some of them are liberal, right? So this is just on the whole spectrum of historians, things that are not disputed modern day, okay? So first one is that Jesus died by a Roman crucifixion. He was buried. After this happened, the disciples were discouraged. We read about this in the Gospels as well, right? The disciples, starting from when Jesus was arrested, they sort of dispersed, and they were scared and they were hiding, right? So this is another thing accepted by historians. Jesus' tomb was also found empty. So again, this is a historical fact. It's not just something we say in church. The disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus, and they were also willing to die for their beliefs. The proclamation of the resurrection took place early, and by early I mean from the actual event of the resurrection to when people started proclaiming it. And finally, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, became a Christian believer. Every single thing here is accepted by historians. So we can work with these things and discuss them. Everyone with me? Okay. The swoon theory. It's something no historian really accepts this nowadays, but I want to discuss it because you guys will probably hear about it and you should be familiar with it. So several people make the claim that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He either fainted from exhaustion, was given a drug, you know how they say they gave him something to drink, gall mixed with vinegar. Okay, that had a drug in it, so it just seemed like he died. This has a lot of issues, right? Does anyone know how to combat this?
Wasn't he stabbed after in the sun?
Good. Yeah.
Well, I think they further say that Joseph and Nicodemus took Christ off the cross, took him back to the tomb with 100 pounds of herbs, spices, medicines, healed them, used them on him for 3 days, and through Allah's goodwill, they saved him and divine.
So through Allah. So who says this?
Muslims.
The Muslims. I took this straight from, very good. I took this straight from the Quran. We curse them for their saying, indeed, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. And they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to death. What the Muslims are claiming, someone looked like Jesus on the cross. It wasn't actually Jesus who died on the cross. Okay? How do we combat this? Well, first of all, if Christians themselves are saying their God died, right? Why wouldn't the Christians are saying their God died? But here the proponent or the opponent, the Muslims, are saying they didn't die. Which one would actually accept that idea more if it was false? The Christians would, right? Because you would say, oh, my God didn't die. But no, in this case, the gospel writers are just admitting the truth. They're just showing you the facts. They're telling you a story of what happened. But forget about the Christian sources. Even non-Christian sources tell us that Jesus died. Josephus, he was a Jewish historian who wrote a few years after after he died. Tacitus, who was Roman, Thales Greek, and the Jewish Talmud, which contains a few of the Jewish writings, not including the Torah. So all of these non-Christian sources tell us Jesus died. So there's no reason to believe he didn't die here. There's no basis for this. If you're going to believe this verse in the Quran, it's 100% on faith. There's no historical evidence to back it up. Everyone with me? All right. So let's jump right into the first E, the execution of Jesus. like I said, all historians, I would say 99.99% of them, accept that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. I'm going to quickly just list a few things here without getting too medical. We read that Jesus was sweating blood. This isn't just a hyperbole, it's an actual medical condition that you can read about called hematidrosis. Lashes from the Roman guards, these weren't not just like one of our belts and just whipping someone. No, these were leather belts that were interwoven with metal balls and a sharp like bone, right? So every single time you get whipped with one of these things, it causes cuts and it causes bruises underneath your skin that would later be opened with more lashes, right? Bottom line, you lose a lot of blood, okay? So hypovolemic shock because you lose so much blood. Nails driven through the nerves in the wrists and the legs. I thought this was an interesting fact. Excruciating was actually a word that was invented to describe the pain of a person being crucified. And like the etymology of this word, excruciating, means out of the cross. Just an interesting fact. Respiratory acidosis, so the person being crucified, it becomes harder for them to breathe. Eventually, the CO2 levels become too high and you suffocate. And finally, pericardial and pleural effusion, basically just fluid buildup in the lungs and the heart. And that comes, someone said Jesus was pierced with a spear. We're going to get back to that.
That's the reason why there was water.
That's the reason why there was water. And the blood is coming from the blood in the heart. You can take a picture of this citation, the Journal of the American Medical Association. They describe all of this. By the way, impact factor of this journal is like 40-something. This is a credible journal. It's a solid article. 1986, I think, yeah. And it takes you through the medical evidence to say Jesus, after suffering all these things, which are accepted by historians, must have died on the cross. Everyone good? Okay. But was he really dead after suffering all these things, right? A skeptic could still ask a question. Well, Roman executioners, that was their job. If they had a 9 to 5, it would be killing people. Like, that's what they had to do. So, on top of that, if a prisoner escaped from the hands of an executioner, those people or that person would be killed that same way. So if my job was to crucify Jesus and Jesus escaped, I would be crucified. Now, as a Roman person who doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, why would I let him go? Why would I even risk myself being crucified? Yeah.
How do we know that was the punishment for the executioner? Like, on what sources is that based?
The Roman, I wish I had this. We have Roman tablets that were decrees from, I think, Tiberius Caesar, who was the emperor at this time, and I think I have that. I can send it to you. But basically, it's not like an oath. It's like an oath, but basically your duty as a Roman guard. These are the questions. Next, we have from the Gospels that Jesus' legs were not broken because he was already dead. So breaking the bones or breaking the legs of the person being crucified, that's gonna basically prevent the person who's being crucified from breathing, because you have to actually push up with your legs to breathe. That's something discussed in the article that I just showed you guys. But Jesus was already dead, so that's why they didn't break his legs. And if it wasn't enough, the spear would have for sure ended everything, because it actually pierced, they say, part of the lung and definitely the heart. And that's where the blood and the water is coming from. On top of all this, I'm just going to add sort of a spiritual component. If he did some way walk alive and he didn't die, the disciples would have seen him with his wounds, right? He wouldn't have been, if he didn't really rise from the dead, he would still be the same person, but in terrible condition. So how could he then go to the disciples, hey guys, I'm risen from the dead, and they see him, he can barely walk, he can barely breathe. They wouldn't have the faith to actually go and baptize the nations or even die for him. That's more of a philosophical question. Is everyone okay with accepting the fact that Jesus actually died on the cross? Is there any skeptic here that has a question? Okay. So I'll move on to the second E, the empty tomb. The empty tomb is something we don't discuss too much, I think, in church because we all take it for granted. But this is another historical piece of evidence. The tomb was empty. So question number one, was Jesus really buried in the tomb? Well, the four Gospels all say Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus' body and buried him in a new tomb. Who is Joseph of Arimathea? Anyone? Was he a friend of Jesus? The disciple?
No.
So who was it?
Isn't he a part of Sanhedrin?
Yes, he was one of the people in the council of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the council that basically sentenced Jesus to death. But we find, I think, from the Gospel of Luke, Joseph of Arimathea wasn't actually there when the sentencing happened. The point is, if I'm a gospel writer and I'm making up a narrative that Jesus died and rose, why would I say Joseph of Arimathea took the body? Wouldn't I make up some other name, someone who's not known? Do you guys see the connection? The fact that all four gospel accounts name this person, that he specifically took the body and buried him, and that he's known, says a lot. It's just saying, it basically says that the gospel writers are just reporting events that happened. So, like I said, why would they make these up? The early Christians weren't friends with the Jews, right? They probably had some animosity towards the Jews for killing Jesus. So you wouldn't say Joseph of Arimathea took the body just because, like, it's something you wouldn't make up. It's highly also unlikely, if you're telling a lie, or if you're going to make something up, it's very unlikely for you to make up a specific story about a specific person in a specific group, and then distribute that story to a bunch of people. Why? For example, if I'm writing an email to everyone here, and I tell you guys, Uncle Samir knows nothing about the Old Testament, you guys all would know I'm lying, right? Because you're all alive with me and Uncle Samir, and you know that he knows it very well. The same exact thing for the gospel writers and for the Jewish people. The Jewish people know who the Sanhedrin people are. They know who Joseph is. So if I make up a story about Joseph of Arimathea, everyone reading my gospel would know I'm lying. Right? So the readers could check the facts for themselves. In the same exact way, the gospel writers can't possibly make things up about Pontius Pilate and Jesus, because the contemporaries live these events. If I say Jesus was crucified the week after the Passover, you lose all credibility, because everyone knows it was the day before the Passover, right? It's the same exact way as me being a journalist now, I can't say LeBron James is the president, because he's not, and everyone knows he's not, right? If you're going to use specific people in a specific way, in a specific story, you have to be telling the truth. Otherwise, you lose credibility with your readers. Make sense? The third question about the empty tomb is, was it actually secure? So we read, it's actually only in the Gospel of Matthew do we hear that there were guards around the tomb of Jesus. And some apologists actually don't even discuss the guards in front of the tomb because it's not necessary to the story. But it's a nice detail to have. So back in the day, we can read from manuscripts, from ancient texts, that the way it actually worked. I wish we had a picture, but this works. So the large stone that's usually a disc shape is a circle, and then it has some thickness to it. It's actually rolled downhill, very easily downhill, and it's put in front of the tomb like this. If you want to remove the stone from the tomb, you actually have to roll it back uphill. The slight tilt. So it would take multiple men to do this, right? It's not something easy to do uphill. So here's how the argument went down. I have the green is Christian, the red is the Jews. So the Christians say Jesus is risen from the dead. The Jews say the disciples stole the body. Okay? The people say, well, if the disciples stole the body, there were guards there, they would have seen them. They would have stopped them, right? The Jews say the guards were asleep. And then in Matthew's Gospel, we read that the Jews bribed the guards to say he was asleep. Does this dialogue tell us anything about the guards? Some deductive reasoning here. Yeah. We have to, so you have to really start thinking about what we have. The Jews are saying the guards were asleep. The fact that the Jews said the guards were asleep means there must have been guards, right? If there were no guards, the Jews would have said, "Are you crazy? There are no guards. What are you talking about?" So the fact that Matthew's gospel was circulated, by the way, who was Matthew writing to? Matthew was specifically writing to the Jews. That's why he includes all these prophecies. So the fact that Matthew's gospel was accepted and circulated, and he didn't lose credibility, means what he wrote is true, right? And I want to take a look at an excerpt from Matthew. Can someone read this, please?
Now while they were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priest all the things that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day.
So Matthew, if you're making up this story, why would you include this last sentence? This saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Because if I'm a Jewish person and I'm reading this, no, this is not commonly said. I throw the manuscript out. Done, right? Matthew's gospel is done. But the fact that he's actually being so specific, he's giving us a complete narrative, right? That the guards went to the priest gave them money. The priest told the guards what to tell the people. The fact that this is all known at the time, it makes a lot of sense when you take Matthew's gospel and you put it in the context of that time, right? You get to actually see that he couldn't have been making this stuff up. It would actually be counter to his goal. So we discussed the two E's. The first one was what? Execution of Jesus. And the second was the empty tomb, right? So skeptics will raise a few more questions about the empty tomb. I'll go through them pretty quickly. First one, the disciples went to the wrong tomb. What's the problem with this? Because I guess it's possible, right? The disciples may have went to the wrong tomb. Anton?
We can't steal the body if we go to the wrong tomb. Right?
They didn't steal the body. Jesus' body, well, the skeptics will say, his body was still in the tomb, but it was in a different tomb.
They could have just went to the right tomb. You know, like here he is.
Exactly. Joseph of Arimathea is not a stranger. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, right? This is like the leaders of the Jewish community, right? So, let's go to the next one. If the disciples went to the wrong tomb, the Jews would go to the Sanhedrin, hey, show us the right tomb. There's Jesus. He's still dead. But the fact that they couldn't do that means the Jews are implicitly assuming or affirming that Jesus was not in the tomb. Does that make sense? Keep in mind also the empty tomb, that alone wasn't enough to convince the disciples that Jesus was risen, right? Because Mary Magdalene and the women, they were the first ones to realize that Jesus wasn't in the tomb, right? They go back and say he's risen, and the disciples don't even believe them, right? So the empty tomb alone wasn't enough. It's not like our whole faith is based on the empty tomb. It's all of the evidences come together. So again, this idea that the disciples stole the body, it's going to really go down to this idea that no one dies for a lie they know is a lie. So people can die. You can be a martyr for something you really believe in your heart, but you're not going to sacrifice or give your life for something you know is a lie. Because it just makes no sense, right? If it's a lie, and you know it's a lie, why would you die for it? There's no point. Yeah.
Sometimes you do it for money or greed or whatever it is.
But you're doing it for a reason.
Yeah.
In this case, it's just a lie. But keep money in your mind. Yeah.
I just want to go off that. I mean, the disciples didn't really gain anything from spreading this if it was a lie. Like they didn't become rich.
They did actually.
They became rich?
Huh?
Go back where you read it.
We're talking worldly.
Yes,
yes.
as a spirit.
Yes.
So Ramani actually.
No, I'm talking actually rich.
Oh, Rick.
Yeah. In Acts, when all the people sold their
It was for the
land
church though, it wasn't for the
and gave the money to them. I know, but they gave the money to the disciples because they saw Jesus was coming back. Like,
It was to fund the church.
That gave the money to the
It was to
disciples.
fund the church.
well, if you want to look at it from a non-Christian perspective, it's not going to look that way.
That's it saying in the Bible that they
Who knows? Just because it says it doesn't mean it's true. Didn't you keep some of the silence?
Guys, Mark wants to say something.
The only documentation on that is from Acts, and that documentation says that it was distributed amongst those who were in need. It never said anything, so it's inconsequential what you think. The only report is that, so you have to accept it. Otherwise, it's just arbitrary. It's your thoughts versus what's recorded.
Well, how do I know what's recorded was true?
It doesn't matter. It's recorded. It's more authentic than what you have to say because these are contemporaries versus you 2,000 years later who's speaking your mind.
Yeah, Mena?
I think if that were the case and they were in it for the money, I think when it came to the point of death, they would simply have said, we were just lying, we don't really believe this happened. And then they would confess loyalty to whatever Roman king and maintain their wealth, which I'm sure they were being offered at that time, rather than dying a horrible death. So if they were doing it for a reason, they wouldn't continue to do it until death. They would stop and say, you're right, I was just doing this for the money. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Canadians and Sapphira, the people who came up with all the riches, got struck down because they weren't honest. So the money wasn't like, oh, I'm being rich because I'm taking the money. It's more like, I'm going to use this money for service. And a couple of chapters before that, when Saint Stephen was chosen as one of the deacons out of the seven and stuff, the purpose of their deaconhood was to serve widows and poor people. So basically, like, even the deaconhood wasn't as established as it was now. So it was the idea of just serving others. So when you say when the money comes, I'm becoming rich, it's kind of stupid. They're using the money for God's glory. This is basic as it gets.
I want to actually, not me, someone.
Excuse me, I just got offended. They just called me.
What Mena Dober just said, guys, stay with me, was summarized in a book, and I have an excerpt. Can you read it for me, actually, Mena? If I can get it.
Why would the apostles lie? If they lied, what was their motive? What did they get out of it? What they got out of it was misunderstanding, rejection, persecution, torture, and martyrdom.
If my reward for a lie is persecution, torture, and death, I'm not going to believe that. I'm just give up that lie, right? If someone puts a gun to my head, and let's say I was going around saying I'm a girl, I'm a female, and someone puts a gun to my head, tell me you're a guy, I'm going to say I'm a guy, right? I'm not going to die for a lie. It makes no sense. There's nothing to gain there. So, by the way, no historians today believe the disciples stole the Bible. It's another piece of evidence. The presence of divergent details. Does everyone know what divergent details are? Okay, so let's say someone's on trial and they bring in witnesses, and the witnesses tell two different stories, but they have the same general story with some details that are different. That's what divergent means. Little details that are different between the two accounts. So it's a fact. The four Gospels do contain divergent details, but you have to be careful because all of these divergent details are only in the secondary details. Things that don't matter too much for the story. I'll show you what I mean. The core of the story is the same. Jesus was alive. He died by crucifixion, was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was visited by a small group of women. The tomb was empty, and the angels say Jesus is risen. That's the story that's consistent between the four Gospels. What changes is who was in this group of women, right? Some people say Mary Magdalene, not some people, some gospel accounts say Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Some say it was Mary and Salome, right? But can someone read for me this paragraph? Excerpt.
True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty.
So this was an excerpt from a book by Michael Grant, who's actually, he's a historian more on the skeptical side. I told you I'm taking from historians that are skeptical and who are liberal, both. What he's basically saying is, if the historians as a community are going to be consistent with the New Testament as they are with other ancient texts, then there shouldn't be any issue with these divergent details. Because all stories have divergent details, right? But the core is the same, so it should be accepted as is. The basic narrative hasn't changed between the four Gospels. So what he's basically saying is be fair. If you're going to accept these other documents, accept the New Testament as well. Or at least accept the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. There are some things that are not necessarily divergent details. They're details that seem like errors, but they're really not. It's just a lack of understanding on our part. For example, did Jesus actually rise on the third day? He was crucified on Friday, right? Well, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. What is the third day? We have to know how did the Jews count their days? The answer is any part of a day counts as a full day. So he was crucified and died on Friday. Friday's a full day. Saturday's a full day. Early Sunday morning is still a full day. So he rose on the third day. So details like these, where we read it, we think it's wrong, but it's actually just a lack of understanding on our part. I wanted to make it contemporary, so divergent detail from our news. New York Times and CBS New York. We had a bunch of winter storms that just came, right? So these are two different articles here. The first one says restless weather, more snow as another nor'easter takes aim. The second one, tri-state residents brace for more snow as nor'easter zeroes in. Seems like they're going to tell the same exact story, right? Let's take a look at what they say. New England is bracing for another winter storm, third in less than 2 weeks. The other one says, tri-state area on Monday, bracing for third nor'easter in less than 2 weeks. Is it the same story? I don't think it's the same story. One says New England, one says tri-state area. Both of these must be false. I'm not going to read them ever again. Makes no sense, right? You have to think, you have to keep it in context, right? Who was the New York Times writing to? Who was CBS New York writing to? Just because these details are a little different, divergent details, doesn't mean the whole story is false. The idea remains the same. That there's going to be a snowstorm that's going to affect a certain population, right? I'll move on. Events related to the resurrection that would not have been made up by the New Testament gospel writers. We discussed the burial of Jesus, right? The fact that they include a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Jews were pretty much the enemies of the Christians back then. And the Jews actually never deny the story. The Jews never say that Joseph didn't take the body. And no alternative burial story has been found in history, period. So that's why historians pretty much accept that the burial of Jesus is solidified as is written in the New Testament documents. The first witnesses of the resurrection. So I mentioned all four Gospels say women were the first witnesses. This is very important because if you place yourself in first century history, women were not considered reliable witnesses. So the fact that all four Gospels are saying they were the first witnesses is going to give us a hint as to what these writers are actually talking about. Namely that they're just saying the facts, what happened. And finally, the explanation of the Jews as we read in Matthew. If the Jews read Matthew's gospel and what he was saying was a lie, he would have lost all credibility and his gospel would not have been accepted or circulated. So I want to go back to women witnesses. Again, if this whole resurrection story was made up and it wasn't based on facts, why would you say women were the first witnesses? And why would you say all the disciples left Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane? Wouldn't you want to make I'm a disciple, right? I'm Matthew. Wouldn't I want to make myself seem like good? I would say I stuck with him from the beginning, I was with him at the crucifixion, and I saw the resurrection with my own eyes. If I'm making the story, that would make me look really good, right? But Matthew's just writing what happened. The disciples fled, so he's going to write the disciples fled. The women were there, so he writes that down. There's a rabbinical saying, let the words of the law be burned rather than delivered to women. That's how much animosity there was for women back at the time. In fact, women weren't even considered reliable witnesses in the court. Didn't exist. They had to be men.
They're like in the time.
This was first century Jewish law. And the gospel writers, like I said, they're basically just acting like reporters. They see what happened, they write about it. End of story. Everyone still with me? I know I'm throwing a lot out there. So until now, I've been pretty much playing defense. Someone comes to us with a question, we respond. And that keeps on going. But these are some examples of things you should, affirmative evidence. So someone asks you, how do you know the tomb was empty? You give them these facts. Again, these facts are accepted by historians. And you come to a logical conclusion from them. There's an early creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Why is this important? Because, does anyone know when Corinthians was written? Corinthians was written, oh, by the way, for sure was written by Paul. No historian disputes this, right? So, this is important because most scholars believe that Corinthians was one of the first New Testament books that are written. So written just a few years after the resurrection. So the fact that Corinthians contains a creed, or a version of the creed, it basically says Christ died and rose and appeared to these many people. The fact that he actually includes a creed means this creed was in existence, circulated, accepted, and he even wrote about it. Like I said, the site of Jesus' tomb was known to the Jews. If Jesus was still in the tomb, the Jews would have went to the tomb, say, hey disciples, there's Jesus, your faith makes no sense. But, of course, we know the tomb was empty. Like I said, women are the first witnesses. There are no alternative explanations for the empty tomb. And finally, the simplicity of the tomb story. What do I mean by simplicity? When you're reading the news is usually not filled with a bunch of emotion, right? Unless something catastrophic happens, but
It's Arabic.
Essentially, a news reporter is supposed to be there as a person, as a mediator, to give you the facts of what happened, okay? That's essentially what we see in the Gospels. The Gospels say Jesus was taken to be crucified. He died, he rose later, he appeared to Mary. I'm going to show you an excerpt from a Gnostic Gospel. Like I mentioned, the Gnostic Gospels come much later, mid-2nd century. So we're talking about over 100 years after this whole resurrection happened, right? And you're going to see the difference between what we accept as gospel, the 4 Gospels, and the Gospel of Peter here, who Peter didn't actually write. I'm going to just read the bolded parts. A multitude came from Jerusalem to the tomb, right? That they might see it was sealed, okay? A great voice was heard in heaven. The heavens opened. 2 men, or angels, descended, and with a great light, and approached the tomb. The stone rolled itself. A lot of miracles here, right? 3 men came forth from the tomb. The cross followed them. Of the 2, the head reached unto heaven. That's in a literal sense. The head reached to heaven. And a response was heard from the cross, yeah or yes. So, does anyone know why I included this? What does this do for our case? Not a rhetorical question. Yeah.
I mean, weren't the Gnostic Gospels considered unreliable and false?
Why were they considered unreliable and false?
Because they were based off of the secret knowledge that they
Exactly.
didn't have.
Right. So the Gnostic Gospels is a collection of these Gospels. Like I said, mid-2nd century. Gnostic movement, basically hidden knowledge that was revealed to people. And then you get all this stuff that we've never heard of before that. And also, it's kind of ridiculous. But this is what I was talking about when I was saying, if I'm making up a story, I'm going to make it extraordinary, right? I'm going to make it seem like I saw all this stuff, and there were witnesses, and we saw, the cross was following them, and it was speaking, right? But the fact that the New Testament documents are so, I don't want to say bland, but they just give you the story as it happened, gives the New Testament credibility. And it discredits these Gnostic Gospels. Does that make sense? Am I doing that time? I'm going to move really quickly for the next piece. Eyewitness testimony. St. Paul says in Corinthians that Jesus appeared to a bunch of people. Who are those people? You have the women, Mary Magdalene, we have Peter, we have the disciples, and then we have something very interesting that's mentioned in Corinthians. He appeared to 500 people at once. That's only said in Corinthians, by the way. If Jesus only appeared to one person, fine, you can say he didn't actually rise from the dead. But if he appeared to all these people, including 500 people, who St. Paul actually says, who St. Paul actually says, the remainder of which remain until this day. So of these 500 people, most of them were still alive. Again, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth. People are reading this. If these people are still alive, I can easily check, are these people actually see Jesus? If they didn't, Paul's making stuff up, I'm not going to believe him anymore. It's that simple, right? Why would Paul include specific names and specific events that didn't actually happen if he was making a story up? Does that make sense with everyone? He was seen, he wasn't just seen. He was heard, physically touched, ate real food. You know the story of Thomas, right? Put your hand here on my side. And the empty tomb would also have to be explained, in addition to these eyewitness testimonies. Finally, and this is something that convicts me more than, it's great to have evidence, but the fact that our faith is rooted and based off the preaching and the death, right, of the disciples of Christ, says something really, really powerful. And so Jesus in Matthew in the Great Commission, he says, "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Well, that's great, Jesus. He's saying this to me, but if you didn't actually rise from the dead, what does that mean, right? Unless I saw you I saw you alive, I saw you dead. Unless I saw you again after you died, why would I believe those words, right? And then die. In John 16, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." Again, what does that mean, you have overcome the world? And John was there, right? John was there at the crucifixion. He saw Jesus. He was the only disciple who was there, right? So if John saw Jesus dead on the cross, buried, why? What's the point of preaching or doing anything? That's it. That's the end, right? Unless he specifically saw the resurrected Jesus. And I just have here, how did the apostles die? A lot of them were crucified. Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. Some of these things are just crazy. Matthias was stoned to death. Philip hung by iron hooks upside down. Why would you go through all this for a lie? Makes absolutely no sense, right? Unless you follow this man who claimed to be God for 3 years, right? These people were living with, even Judas who betrayed Jesus, repented, right? And he went back and he's like, "Here's your money, I have sinned." But of course, it wasn't true repentance. He hung himself. The bottom line is, if you're going to follow a person for 3 years and then die, based off the fact that you saw him die and rise from the dead, there must be something there, right? In addition to all of the evidence I just threw out there. So some references. I just finished this book, Case for Easter. Lee Strobel's a really great writer. This Case for Faith, Case for Christ, a bunch of the cases. And he was basically a convert. He was an atheist. His wife converted to Christianity. Later, he was a reporter actually, which is pretty interesting because he refers to the New Testament writers as reporters, and he's going through the evidences, a bunch of interviews with people. And the other two books are also great. Can we just say the 5 E's real quick? What was the first one? Execution. Detomb. eyewitnesses. Even to death was the last one, and one before. I didn't discuss it too much. It was the early testimony. The end.